Good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Reedy, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOU. Today, we're pleased to present a conversation with a distinguished guest, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or USSOCOM. If you have feedback or questions after this session, email thinkjsou@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Today's moderator is Mr. Kyle Garland, Senior Faculty at the Strategic Studies Department. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reedy. Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland, and I'm with the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers, and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the All Partner Access Network, or APAN. For our online attendees this afternoon, if you have a question for our guest, please submit the question using the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Today, we are honored to have Professor Jacob Shapiro join us to discuss his book titled Small Wars, Big Data, The Information Revolution in Modern Conflict. Jacob Shapiro is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. He is an Associate Editor of Journal of Conflict Resolution, World Politics, and Studies of Conflict and Terrorism. And he is also a faculty fellow of the Association for Analytic Learning about Islam and Muslim Societies. He has also authored The Terrorist Dilemma, Managing Violent Covert Organizations. His research has been published in a broad range of academic and policy journals, as well as a number of edited volumes. Finally, he has conducted field research and large-scale policy evaluations in Afghanistan, Colombia, India, and Pakistan. Professor Shapiro, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Kyle. Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you. Sir, your book illustrates how a new understanding of warfare can help the military fight today's conflicts more effectively. By highlighting the changes in warfare over the last 30 years, moving from large-scale armies on central fronts to insurgencies that deploy more elusive methods, the book presents a nuanced approach to understanding these contemporary confrontations and how they should be fought. But I'd like to begin my questions today with a question about the title of your book, Small Wars, Big Data. While most of us, I think, have probably heard the phrase big data, I suspect that not everyone really understands the meaning of it. So my first question for you, sir, is could you explain big data and what big data methods have to offer in the prosecution of conflict?
Yeah, absolutely, Kyle. I think, the phrase big data really came from originally people thinking about data sets that were too large to handle on a laptop. So you needed to use some kind of industrial computational infrastructure to handle them. And it quickly came to become shorthand for basically what I call digital trace, which is high resolution data that's collected in the course of day-to-day activities. So you can think about, the location data that this handy tracking device, which Apple gets us all to carry, provides. But you can also think about things like the data in something like Blue Force Tracker, right? The system that the US had to track vehicles and even sometimes dismounted patrols in Afghanistan, which gave you the route of every vehicle at every time. And what that kind of information enables you to do is it lets you answer questions that previously were very hard to answer because you couldn't measure the behavior in question in a systematic, quantitative manner.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. I actually very much enjoyed reading the book, and I was a little intimidated by the title, you know, Small Wars, Big Data. But when I opened it up and started reading, I like the way you incorporated vignettes into your writing. And so that's going to be my next question. Very early on in your book, you started telling a story about a father in the Philippines who was faced with a very difficult decision. And then throughout your book, you referred back to that father to help explain certain theories. So I'd like to ask you to explain the story of the Philippine father to our audience and why you chose that to explain the theory.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks. I would love to. And the reason we tell this story, and I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute to help illustrate it, is we wanted to put the reader in the mind space of the civilians caught in the middle of insurgencies. Because in the theory and in the work that we've done, it's the decisions by those civilians about sharing information or not, which really drive the outcome. And everything kind of flows from their decision process. So the story is a way to help people understand what those civilians have to take into account as they make these decisions. So I'm going to use a few slides here just to illustrate this.
Sure.
And you know, I think it's I think they are helpful here. So the story of the father begins about midnight on a night in a city like Mandaluyong City, pictured there in the Philippines on the left. And father is asleep next to his wife in bed, and he hears a noise in the alley outside his house. And that's kind of a weird thing because the area is under curfew. There really shouldn't be people out at night. And so the father in our story goes to the gate of his house, maybe one that looks a little bit like that red fence in the picture, and he looks out. And down at the end of the alley, there's some trash around a telephone pole, and he sees a couple of guys there rooting around in the trash. And now he's nervous because this father, he knows a few things about his area. One is there's been an insurgency there against the Christians from Manila for decades. In fact, you know, some people would say it goes back to the 1500s when the Spanish first showed up. And there are probably people in the insurgency readying an ambush for the patrol that's going to come down the alley in the morning. And this really presents the father with a deep dilemma, because if that patrol comes down the alley and the IED goes off and there's a firefight, his family is put at risk. And so the father has a hard choice to make. And so he looks on the bedstand next to him, and he's got one of these. And so he could pick up the phone and call in a tip, and maybe the police would come that evening and arrest the men. Or maybe they'd tell the army, and the army patrol wouldn't come down the alley in the morning, or they'd come down with more care and then won't set off the IED. But, you know, on either side of him, there are some people who might support the insurgency. And what will they do here? And so the father has this difficult dilemma. And so, you know, he's up and he's thinking about this. And it's really, there's no right answer here. Because if the father shares the information, something happens to him, well, the prospects for his children without a father, you know, they aren't so good. But the way the ambushes play out also put his family at risk. Typically what happens is the insurgents drop the IED on the first vehicle in the convoy and then fire down on it from elevated positions in the surrounding hillsides. And when that happens, oftentimes people get hurt. In fact, just a couple months ago, his uncle was hurt. And if this happens when his wife happens to be cleaning up in the morning from breakfast, or when his kids are on their way to school, maybe one of them will get hurt. And so it seems like maybe he should pick up the phone. But if he does, well, he's also helping the Christians from Manila. And, you know, he doesn't like them being around any more than his neighbors do. So there's not an easy choice for him here. And what's important, I think, to notice is if you step back and you think about those two men planting the IED, if they know that the father is going to call him the tip, they won't plant the IED there. They'll go somewhere else. And if that patrol knows that for sure there's going to be the IED there, because no one on that alley would ever call in the tip, then they might not want to patrol in that area, or they'll do it in a way that makes it very hard to address them. So everyone is kind of anticipating what the father is going to do. And so the father tosses and turns for a couple more hours, and he's no closer to a decision. Because on the one hand, yeah, the soldiers, they're not so great. On the other hand, last month, the soldiers, you know, they brought in some chairs and desks for his kids' school so they can go to school like civilized human beings. And the insurgents have harmed people in the neighborhood too. And so they're not great to have around. And by God, they're putting his family at risk by setting the ambush in the alley outside his home. It's now 4:30 in the morning and he's running out of time to decide. And, you know, what I think is important to think about here is all the elements which are going into this father's decision, right? He's thinking about, can he get the information out? What will happen to him if he does? Will the insurgents retaliate? You know, he has this device, again, next to him, which makes it really safe to share the information compared to even 4 or 5 years ago, when he would have had to get out of his compound, go down that alleyway, not be seen by any of his neighbors, get to the police station without being observed by an agent of the insurgents, share the information with an officer who hasn't been compromised by the insurgents, and get home all without, you know, kind of making noise and waking anyone up. So this whole dynamic is fundamentally changed. And what drives it, what drives the interesting part of this strategic dilemma is that even the father himself is uncertain about what to do. And each of the other fathers and mothers and aunts and grandparents and uncles along that alleyway, each of them is uncertain too. And it only takes one of them to call in the tip on the two men setting the IED to change the dynamic in that alley. And so that's the kind of the big picture of the theory. And so what we imagine happening in these situations is all the actions that each side takes, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure. What they do is they move that father's decision just a little bit to the point where maybe he wants to call in the tip when he wouldn't have the day before, or maybe he doesn't want to call it when he would have the day before. And what those two insurgents are thinking and what their leaders are thinking is, how much violence can we do in an area to put pressure on the government to get political concessions before we are certain that at least one of the fathers on that alley will call in the tip? Because every time we go out to run an operation, someone sees what we're doing. And so, you know, you can put all that stuff in math and run it through a bunch of game theory, and what you get is you get the prediction that across many conflicts, the insurgents will march violence right up to that threshold.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting about this to me is when you look at the captured documents from the insurgency in Afghanistan and Iraq, and from documents the Israelis picked up in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in the Colombian government in Colombia, and Spain in its fight against ETA, they all have letters in which insurgents are talking about the trade-off in these terms. How much can we do before the people get pissed off and start informing on us? And so we think there's some like that story, and the everyone kind of worrying about what that father's going to do actually reflects a big part of the decision dynamic in these conflicts.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, I really enjoyed how you would refer back to the father in the Philippines as your book progressed. It's almost like you developed a relationship with this fictitious father as I was reading the book. So feel free to refer back to the father during this interview if you'd like to.
Well, so one of the things that actually inspired us on the father was my co-author, Joe Felter, spent much of his career in SF in the Philippines. And one of the resources that we developed along the way of writing the book, and there's still a lot of work to do with this, was an archive of about 2,000 interviews that the Armed Forces of the Philippines has done with people who fought on both sides of their insurgency against the New People's Army, the communist insurgency, and the civilians caught in the middle. And so some of the dilemmas that the father faces are actually things that come out in those interviews.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Now I want to talk about another vignette that you put in your chapter 2. This was not a fictitious one, but this was a real one. You describe a story of a young Princeton academic who is briefing the ISAF staff in Kabul, Afghanistan, to include General Stanley McChrystal. He was there present for the briefing. And the brief from this young person was on the impact of civilian casualties on insurgent violence in Afghanistan. And the vignette that you used at the beginning of your chapter sort of set the stage for discussion on, it's called the Empirical Studies of Conflict, or ESOC. So I'd like you to please explain what ESOC is, how it was developed, and what it can do, please.
Absolutely. So ESOC is the Empirical Studies of Conflict project. And this came out of an idea that my colleague, my co-author Joe, and I had many, many years ago when we were both at graduate school in Princeton, which is that doing policy relevant research on conflict really, at least in the kind of empirical political economy tradition that we were both trained in, requires access to data. And getting access to data is hard and time consuming, and it requires building relationships and establishing trust and getting people to take the time to walk you through all the details of how the data were collected and the different decisions they made along the way in building it. And that's a fixed cost that only needs to be paid once, right? Every researcher doesn't need to go out and do that for themselves. And so our idea with ESOC is that we could take our comparative advantage and that of some of our colleagues in terms of working with people in the defense community and begin to bring data out on a whole bunch of different issues so that lots of other people could work with it. And so we began doing that with internal documents from Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in Iraq when Joe was directing the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. We then did it with data on combat incidents in Iraq and Afghanistan and aid spending and the location of combat forces. And then we built data along similar lines in Pakistan and Colombia and India, all basically with the idea that in getting those resources together, we could provide support to a whole wide community of academics which would work on these issues. And we ran some numbers a couple months ago, and as of the beginning of March, ESOC had supported more than 100 peer-reviewed academic research papers, either by providing them with data or by finding the funding to support the researchers working on it. And those papers cover more than a dozen countries around the world. And they're everything from, you know, kind of studies on the influence of aid on conflict in Afghanistan to work that basically helped teach the Mexican government how to report on violence in the drug war in a way that let people understand the effect of decapitation strikes against the various narco organizations so they could refine their policies. So we really, I think we've proven over many, many years the thesis that making it easier for researchers to work on these issues can yield benefits for policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, using that previous example of the academic talking about civilian casualties, General McChrystal understood that this was a very important issue. So much to the point that he issued a tactical directive calling for the ISAF forces to demonstrate what he calls, in quotes, courageous restraint in order to protect civilian safety. And so you address this in your book. In fact, you dedicated an entire chapter to how civilians respond to harm. So could you talk about that briefly, please?
So when you think about the father in the Philippines, one of the things that is front and center for him is how are me and my family going to fare depending on who controls this territory tomorrow. So if the government controls the territory, what are we going to get? What's life going to look like for me and my wife and my daughters? And if the insurgents control the territory, what is it going to look like? And one of the pieces of information that the father uses to figure that out is how much care and attention are they taking during the fight and protecting our lives. And one of the people who I think is kind of most eloquent on this, and so I feel like I should share this point, is Vic Corpus, who's I'm going to share my screen again for a second, just because I think this quote is really wonderful. So Vic is kind of an amazing individual. He was a police officer in the Philippines, and towards the end of the Marcos regime was asked to basically to murder some political opponents, and said no. and defected to the NPA, and was captured quickly and put in prison. And shortly before he was scheduled to be executed, the Marcos regime fell. Aquino came in, released him from prison, and he joined the armed forces of the Philippines and eventually rose to be the leader of their military intelligence organization. And one of the things that Vic talks about in his books and in conversations is what's in this quote, which is that when the insurgents do harm to civilians, even inadvertently, they begin to shift in their perception of what life will be like if they're in charge, and become more willing to share information with the government, even under the risk of harm. And so you want to avoid that. And the reverse exists for the government. So what we did in 2010, this was Arada Iyengar, who's now a senior researcher on kind of bad uses of the platform at Google, is we looked very carefully at escalation of force incidents. And we tried to understand what was the net effect when escalation of force incidents and went bad, or when raids involved civilian casualties. And what we found at the time was that there was a systematic kind of long-run increase in violence against ISAF following civilian casualty incidents by ISAF, and much less of a reaction against the insurgency. So the results in Iraq are a little bit different than that. And it varies in different regions of Iraq depending on the local politics. Like generally the pattern seems to be that the locally popular side gets a pass for violence against civilians. So, you know, they have to do more harm to earn the same reaction. But systematically there was that increase. And later work in Iraq, where we managed to get declassified data on actually the flow of tips to coalition forces, shows that when insurgents harm civilians in Iraq, systematically the tips flowing to coalition forces went up for a number of weeks after insurgents hurt civilians. And so what's going on is people are reacting to that information. And so when General McChrystal issued the initial tactical driving directives and started to raise the idea of courageous restraint, there was this loose sense that maybe certain actions taken in self-defense could do more harm than good in the long run.
Okay.
And but there was no evidence on that. And so we tried to put together some quantitative evidence to say how bad is that trade-off, and therefore what kind of risk should it justify soldiers taking.
Okay, so I want to take a question from one of our audience members, and the question has to do back to the big data. The member writes, he says, although everyone acknowledges data is out there, there's an equal number of complaints that data banks are not readily available or accessible. Mm-hmm. So his question to you is, what are the best data sources, and what are possibly the lesser known or underused sources of data that might be useful for our audience members?
Well, so it's going to depend obviously on the question that's of interest. So I would kind of reframe it, and I would ask the question slightly differently, which is, as we go out into operational settings and we want to use data to inform our decisions, what's the team that we need to do the best work and to integrate? And one of the things that I've observed over a number of years is that we're not yet good at building the teams we need to answer the kinds of questions that would be useful in planning day-to-day operations. And in particular, we are very good at building people who are really good at digging deep into an area. And we're quite good, when I say we, I mean, kind of the US military and the defense establishment. We're very good at building the kind of people who can do amazing things with data, who can crunch massive volumes of information and show you all kinds of trends and patterns. What we have fewer of, and what we don't often put in teams with those deep experts and the people who can work on the data, is people who are good at thinking about, how do I use the data to answer a commander's question? And so, you need these kind of functional teams that have those three pieces. And that middle one, that person who can connect the dots between what's the question the commander is asking, and then what are the things I can do with the data. I think that's where we're missing. So there's no one answer to that question.
Okay.
It's just very context dependent, but for sure, we need to think more about how to build those cross-functional teams that will be able to make the most of the information.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fair enough. And I have another audience member question, which sort of relates to just what you were talking about. You said that we're good at doing some things, but we may not be able to bridge certain gaps when it comes to data and how it's used in a campaign. So this question is also from an audience member. And in your opinion, where is big data delivering the best value, at the tactical level or further up the chain of decision making? And then also the follow-on question is there a lag in between the data collection and the analysis and the recommendation? It's
a great question, and I think there's tremendous value that's definitely being delivered at the tactical level, and that's been very clear. It's obvious in the case of targeting. That's been very well documented, and people talk about that a lot. But it's also true in the context of thinking about trends in local public opinion and how populations are responding to different issues. The lag can be quite short. So in some work we did to support ISAF back in 2011, it was a matter of weeks between when we were trying to understand kind of how much insurgents were moving around the country. And it was a matter of weeks between when the question was posed and when we were briefing it to a stand-up with the ISAF commander. So that can happen very quickly. Where the gap is when you get to the operational and strategic level questions. Being able to answer them with solid data as evidence requires recording the reasons for decisions at the time they're made. And there's this kind of deep epistemological reason for that, which is if I observe a relationship between a policy and an outcome, I need to know whether the policy caused the outcome or the policy was put where it was because of anticipated outcomes. So this is easy to think about in the context of like aid spending, right? If you observe that the places where you spend more aid within a country that has an insurgency have more violence, it's not necessarily that the aid is causing violence. It could be that the officials, because they believe aid works to reduce violence, put it in the more violent places. And so causality runs in the other direction. To circumvent that and answer questions like, is this policy working or not? You need to either include some arbitrariness in where the policy is implemented. So either randomize within some set of places or use a hard decision rule that forces some places into getting the policy and some places not. Or you need to understand the decision-making process in great detail so that you can model it and figure out what would have happened here where I did the policy if I had not done the policy. So to get at that, in the process of decision-making, you need someone sitting there recording why the places where the thing was done were chosen. What were the metrics that were looked at? What were the criteria that were used? What were the data that went into that? And typically we don't do that. And so then when an analyst comes at it later and has this awesome data on the outcomes and what happened, they can't answer that fundamental question of why did the policy happen here but not there? Right. And without that, they can't answer often the operationally and strategically relevant questions. And that goes back to like staffing is critical. We don't, the way we're kind of organized now, we don't have a mechanism by which the folks who will be asked the question at some point around like, what should we do about this problem or that problem, are sitting in the room when the policies are being made, so they can record why things were done in one place and not another, to enable 4, 5, 6 months later that analysis of what worked or what didn't work. So we have to get the people who are going to be doing the analysis in the future kind of left of bang, so to speak, so that they can see why things are being done at the start. And then they will have the information so that later when the question is asked, they can actually answer it. And this is not like a problem unique to the US military. Fundamentally, when like the big internet platforms want to know, like, are the things we're doing for disinformation, making the disinformation problem better or worse? They have a huge problem answering that question for exactly the same reason. Because when they take decisions about, okay, we're going to take down like these posts, but not those posts, no one's sitting there recording that so that 6 months later, when one of their analysts goes back, they have the record and they can figure out what would have happened had they not taken down those posts.
Well, let's change gears just a little bit. We are hearing and reading a great deal on the great power competition these days. I think we understand that, you know, small wars are probably not going to go away, but can you explain to the audience why the theories and concepts presented in your book are relevant in this new era, or maybe not new era, but revised era of great power competition?
Yeah, I think the simplest thing to do is to think back to the last era of great power competition. And there were no major wars fought during that era of great power competition. The wars that were fought, with the exception of the Korean War, were basically small wars. They were insurgencies, they were rebellions, and both sides fought them. And the way in which great power competition played out during the Cold War was insurgencies and revolutionary conflicts in dozens of countries. And so when I hear, you know, return to great power competition, what that makes me think of is return to the Cold War, when the rate of wars within states was much higher than it is now. And when the death toll around the world from intrastate war was much higher than it is now. You know, if you take out the conflagration in Syria from the kind of count of civil wars around the world, things are much better now than they were at almost any point in the Cold War. And if you look at the war in Yemen, that is exactly the result of regional power competition. That's the kind of war we're going to see. It's not one where you have the two large regional powers going head to head, right? They're fighting through proxies in what is essentially, you know, the kind of conflict that we're thinking about in this book.
Well, you mentioned it, so this is probably a good time to ask it. The book mentions that since Vietnam, there's been the world has experienced much more intrastate wars than the interstate wars, so the wars between nations, as you just mentioned. The book further states that the character of these interstate wars has changed over time. Right. So what do you mean by changed over time? Will you please explain that?
Yeah, so one of the, if you look at the war in civil war in Syria, one of the really interesting things is that you have support from many countries for many different reasons to many different sides, and that has made the war kind of particularly intractable, because the things which were acceptable bargaining points between any two of the outside supporting actors would not be acceptable to some of the others. And certainly early on in the war, when the opportunities for settlement were present, one of the things that was true on the side of the insurgency is many individuals could go and fundraise from wealthy individuals to support their battalion or their organization. And so they had no reason to settle. They could get the money to go on fighting. And instead of the Cold War situation where you had basically two main ideological camps who were funding everyone, now at least for conflicts in which one side is represented by Sunni Islamist groups, there's this kind of distributed fundraising system that can be tapped to raise money to support the conflict. What that means is the incentives for settlement are lower. And where during the Cold War, if the two major powers wanted a war to be settled, it would be settled. It's no longer clear that that's the case, because you do have, for certain kinds of conflicts, this ability to raise money in a distributed way to keep the fight going long after the major sponsor wants to call it quits.
So as a follow-on question, then I want to read a quote to you from your book. Okay. The quote reads, "Persistent intrastate conflict is one of the great scourges of our era." And I think there's a lot of people in our audience that would agree with that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Why is this true?
So I think we don't have to look any further than the civil war in Syria. So if you think about the sequelae of the civil war in Syria, you have the exit of the UK, arguably. You have millions of refugees. You have a massive shift to the right in politics in a number of EU countries. You have now a non-democratic government in the EU, which poses an existential threat to the European Union. You've had the UK leave the EU in part because of nativist sentiment triggered by refugee flows. You have had kind of the pending collapse of the peace settlement in Lebanon for 5-6 years, kind of massive instability. You've had kind of a conflict which has enabled reactionary forces across the Middle East to push back on calls for democratization and the modernization of civil society. All of that stemming from the conflict over who's going to govern Syria. And so, you don't even have to kind of look at the casualty numbers. Just the kind of disruption that these conflicts can cause is truly astounding. And, that is in some ways, kind of the example. But other conflicts have posed similar risks. So if you think about the war in Yemen, right, you had a potential for massive disruption to world energy supplies because of that conflict. So it's not, it's not just the people immediately exposed who are suffering. It's all the things it does beyond the kind of confines of the conflict to endanger other values in the world.
Yeah. Well, so I'd like to take a question from our audience again. Mm-hmm. And this has to do with a recent memo that was published by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it was dated May 1st of 2020. And have you read it by chance?
I have not.
Okay. Well, it's basically a revamping of our professional military education. So obviously, I'm not going to ask you specifics on the memo, but the question is, what, in your opinion, are the critical skill sets needed for our officers and our enlisted in order to be comfortable with big data? How to analyze it, how to utilize it, how to get it up the chain, down the chain, so it's timely. And this PME change is going to be significant because I believe that the entire curriculum, learning outcomes, much is going to be changed as the basis of it. So once again, how do our members, what skill sets do they need in order to be comfortable with big data?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to recognize is that using evidence from big data to inform decisions is actually no different than using evidence from other kinds of data. Like the same core principles apply. And in fact, teach a course called Leading Evidence-Based Decisions, in which we really try to hammer this idea home, whether your data are stories about 2 different places or data about 20 million different individuals. Many of the same questions apply. And so I don't think there's a skill set that's unique to big data. I think what we need to think about is how do we train certain cognitive skills to people so that they recognize the similarities between the questions. So for example, when someone presents you with a regression analysis, which shows you that there's a correlation between X and Y, and you look at it and you say, well, but I think that, I'm not sure that that represents the region that I'm interested in. That is exactly the same argument epistemologically that you would make if someone told you a story about a conflict in, say, made some reference to World War II to justify a decision. And you thought to yourself, gosh, but the world is totally different from then. Like, we have computers and like everyone has a TV and everyone's much wealthier. It's just a different world, so that doesn't apply. Those are fundamentally the same question. And so when I think about the core skills that we need, there are basically 3 that I think about as being critical. The first is recognizing what is credible evidence for what kinds of claims and what is not. And so oftentimes people will use evidence to support a claim that is not, that like sounds good, but is not in fact the kind of evidence you need for that kind of claim. And so being able to figure that out is critical. The second is distinguishing correlation from causation and being aware of what each is useful for. Like we often hear correlation doesn't equal causation, which is not true. Like sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And that depends on the features of the situation. And so we need to train people better to do that. And then the last is, I think we need to inculcate a basically culture of questioning decisions. So when you think about the kinds of teams that are most effective at avoiding many of the pitfalls in using evidence to inform decisions, they tend to be teams that have a certain habit of mind in which questioning assumptions is kind of central to everyone's conception of what it means to be a good team member. And so as we think about revamping PME, and we think about how do we make the most of data, one of the critical skills is actually the ability to engage in those kind of critical dialogues without it, without the kind of responsibilities and lines of authority playing into the ways in which the discussion plays out. So on the leader's part, that means feeling comfortable with someone junior saying, hey boss, that's wrong and here's why. And on the part of junior participants, that means being comfortable that when you call out your boss, even if you're wrong about it, your boss is going to be happy that you did so and not feeling like, you know, unless like I make the point in exactly the right way, like I'm going to be in trouble. And that's like there's a training and a culture issue there, but to make the most of data, we need to get better at that.
Yeah, that second part might be the more difficult part for sure.
Yeah. Changing culture is hard.
That's right. Well, although I think junior officers are much better at speaking their mind, and I think senior officers are better at taking the input. So I don't want to paint a negative picture on it. I think it's definitely doable. Another question from our audience, and I'm not going to paraphrase this because I might mess it up, but I'm going to read this one for you.
Okay.
And it reads, in the new paradigm of misinformation, propaganda campaigns, cyber campaigns, etc., how does this impact data scientists and analysts and the adherence to trusted methodology, data integrity, or chain of custody? And have you seen an encroachment of this issue specifically to the defense sector?
It's a great question, and I think there are a couple of issues to think about here. One is it is close to impossible to manipulate data in a way that is both hard to detect and gets you to a known answer. So the level of skill and statistical acumen required to go in and not just like flip digits in a spreadsheet, but flip them in a way that gets you a desired outcome given some anticipation of what the analytical process is going to be. That's like next level Jedi stuff that no one can do. So I don't think we should be worried about that. I think the thing to worry more about is that there's just a tremendous amount of noise being put into all the things that we might analyze, particularly when we think about information operations. And it's not just the malign actors. So was in a meeting, we hosted our ESOC annual meeting a couple weeks ago. And one of the speakers was Brian Fishman, who worked with me and Joe actually back at the Combating Terrorism Center a long time ago, and now runs Facebook's dangerous organizations group, basically the people who try and crack down on criminal organizations, terrorists, fraudsters, and others on their platform. And Brian raised the point, which was, I thought, very deep, which is that whatever the data are that you see on the outside, we are continually screwing that up because of all the things we're doing to try and make the platform a nice, safe place. So we're continually removing accounts, changing things, taking down data. And so like what you see at one point in time is not a reflection of what people actually did. It's like what they did net of all the things that we're trying to do against them. And the things we're trying to do against them are totally dynamic and changing all the time. So there's a tremendous amount of noise in the system. that becomes a real problem when the data are big, because the traditional ways we have of assessing whether or not a relationship is meaningful start to break down when the data get really big, because every relationship looks statistically significant. And so it requires a slightly more nuanced job from the analyst to not just say, like, is this thing statistically meaningful, but is it substantively meaningful? Is it realistic? Does it match some theory of the world before you push like the I believe button and go out and advocate policy around it?
Right, absolutely. Well, thank you. The next question is, I want to discuss a model that your book introduces. It's an asymmetric, it's a model of asymmetric conflict based on the three-way interaction between the government, the people, and the insurgency or the rebels. And I think most of our audience members will say, well, that's not a new model at all. I've read about it in the past. I think we understand it. But you focus on the information aspect of the model. And that's what I'd ask you to discuss, please.
For sure. So when we think about that model, we're thinking about it in a somewhat US-centric perspective, which is that if the geotemporal coordinates of an insurgent or group of insurgents are known, something can be done about them. And that is representative of a large class of conflict, but not all of them. What we wanted to think about is what drives the sharing of that information or not. And when you focus in on that, some non-obvious things come up. So one non-obvious thing that comes up is if the insurgency is not constrained in their supply of labor, then many of the kinds of things that governments have thought about doing in terms of trying to put people to work so they don't participate in the insurgency, they're kind of like beside the point. They're not going to make a difference either way. A second thing that pushes you towards thinking about is basically the role of non-combatants and hearts and minds, not in terms of like an electoral model where you think about we have to move like the median voter or the mass of people so that they support the government, but one where you need to think about the people who are on the margin. Because, like go back to the father, you think about all the fathers on that alley, you don't need 50% plus one of them to share information for the government to shut down those two insurgents setting the IED. You just need one. And so even if 90% of the people on that alley are true believers, if an action is taken which moves someone in the 10% against the insurgents, that's enough. And so that pushes you to thinking about the kind of struggle to earn popular goodwill in a different way. Right? It's not about mass politics and competition for mass goodwill. Instead, it's about figuring out what do the people who are on the margin care about and how do you move them? So I think it takes the focus in a little bit of a different direction.
Right. Well, I remember a lecture I attended by a JTF 510 commander, which is OEF Philippines. Mm-hmm. And I remember the model that he put up, and it was that government, insurgency, and people, and how you want to strengthen the relationship between the government and the people and break the relationship between the people and the insurgents, and of course, attack the relationship government between the insurgency. So that's where I first saw it. So I was interested to read about it in your book. But also in that lecture, he talked a lot about economic development, mm-hmm. And assistance. And you dedicate 2 chapters to the role of developmental assistance in economic conditions in an insurgency. And of course, one of our harder lessons learned in Iraq is that managing the policies after a conflict is very critical. And really nothing shows this better than the collapse of the order in Anbar in the mid-2010s. So can you please discuss this a little bit more, expand on it, please?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 things that come up in that discussion, in that question, Kyle. And one is about kind of economic development, and then the other is, I think, the theory of change, which is how does doing the small things right get you to the big outcomes? And so when you think about economic development and conflict, I think the theory that a lot of people have in mind is that participation in the insurgency works a little bit like a normal labor market. Like you have to choose, are you going to fight or are you going to work? And a substantial portion of people make that decision on the basis of some combination of the economic returns and political sentiment. And that's certainly true of some conflicts, but in a lot of modern conflicts, a large share of the insurgents' labor force is actually part-time. It's people doing the work in the evenings and on the weekends and in between times on their normal job because they believe in the cause, not because they want to like only fight and not work. So that starts to break things down. The second thing that starts to break things down when you think about that labor market vision, which motivates the economic development as a tool of combating insurgency, is that the insurgents are competing on salary for workers. And one of the kind of amazing things that we learned in work on Iraq is that the fighters in many of the insurgent groups were terribly paid. Like at one point in 2007, when in what was then the Islamic State of Iraq, the median salary in the group was below what the average unemployed illiterate person could cobble together on a monthly basis. In a group that at the time had a 44% annual mortality rate. So that is not like a normal labor market. That's not them going out and paying wages to compete for like the marginal unemployed, right? They're paying survival wages so that the truly dedicated can join the group and feed their families. And that's just a fundamentally different market to play in. This is not unfamiliar to labor economics. There are all kinds of jobs in the real world where people have basically are paid in part through amenities. So for example, in many of the Alaska fisheries, people are undercompensated for the risk they're taking because it feels good to go into the bar at the end of the day and say, I'm a crab fisherman, I'm tough, right? And so they're not paid for the risk that they take. And similarly, in the insurgencies, people are willing to do it because the compensating differential, the thing that makes it worth doing, is fighting for a cause they believe in. But that like breaks that link with the labor market that we normally think of. Right. And that's why we think economic development doesn't always have like the effect that one would think. Let me pivot though to the second part of your question, which I think is the more interesting one, which is like what comes afterwards. So, you know, it's really tempting to look at Afghanistan and Iraq and say, you know, the United States spent somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion fighting those conflicts. It depends, you know, how you account for the legacy costs. And over almost 20 years. And in exchange for that, we have a Iranian-aligned government in Iraq, where we have marginal strategic influence, and a government in Afghanistan that is friendly, but controls somewhere around a third of its territory at night. Now, if you had told anyone in 2001 or 2002 or 2003, hey, here's the plan, we're going to spend $5 trillion, and 20 years from now, we're going to have achieved none of our aims except for preventing those territories from being used to launch terrorist attacks against the United States, people would have looked at you like you were a Martian. But that's kind of where we are. And so when you look at that history, it is tempting to think, well, wow, the things that we did must not have worked. And this is an argument that you sometimes see as a justification for turning away from the lessons of those wars. And I think that's wrong because there's a difference between doing the things that can win a village or a valley and translating those into the political outcome that you want at the end of the day. And Iraq really, it's like such a tragic case of that, because by early to mid 2009, actions of US and coalition forces and Iraqi forces had created a political space in which accommodations between the Sunni and Shia populations and their elites could have been made. And they weren't. And so 4 years later, the government of Iraq is engaging in fairly awful repression against its Sunni population. That population looks across the border to Syria, sees what's going on, sees a group that wants to come in, and large portions of it in Anbar and Nineveh province say, yeah, okay, it's no worse than what we have now. And that's where you get the breakdown of order and the war, the second civil war in Iraq. That is not a failure of the approach that was taken from 2006 through 2009 to restore order and beat back the insurgency in Iraq. that's a failure of the political processes which happened on top of it. And so I think we make like this mistake when we look at the strategic outcomes and we say, they're not great, therefore the things we did cannot have been great. In fact, some of those things worked in the way they were designed to do, but the follow-up was not there. There's a slightly, I think, deeper point here, which is in the planning process. If you think about, you read the memoirs of the planning processes and the various conflicts. And one of the things that's like mind-blowing in reading these is that senior political leaders are spending a tremendous amount of time thinking about the portion of the process which can for sure be executed. There was very little doubt that the military campaign in either Iraq or Afghanistan or later Syria would be executed effectively. Right? The question was what came next. And that was where the politicians had unique insight. But that wasn't where they spent their time in the planning process, at least, based on what you can see in the memoirs. And so there's this interesting thing of people getting kind of sucked into part of the process, which is not the part of the process that in 10, 15, 20 years will really matter. Right? It's the part of the process that matters like in the next year or 2 years. But beyond that, there's like much more.
Right. Well, sir, before I ask you my final question, I want to go back to our audience for a comment, and I'll ask you to comment on it, please. It reads, the person writes, I believe it is more precise to address not only data, but more importantly, the trends. Mm-hmm. He says, I truly believe these trends have to be deeply considered within a specific environment. Similar data and trends taken into account into different environments can trigger different answers to the same issue. What are your thoughts on that, please?
I think that's absolutely right. And the way I like to think about this is what are the enabling conditions for a given policy to have a given effect? And so, when we think about, for example, the decision by the Obama administration in 2009 to increase force levels in Afghanistan, one of the arguments that was used, it wasn't the dominant one, but one of the arguments that was used was an intense period of counterinsurgency done in a particular way in Iraq led to a dramatic political change and an opening for political dialogue between two communities that have been fighting. And we will have the same outcome in Afghanistan. So we surged in Iraq, loosely put, it worked. We should think about something similar in Afghanistan. And the people who argued against that made exactly the point which Antonio is making, which is that the environments were fundamentally different. There were some enabling conditions that were present in Iraq, which were not present in Afghanistan. And so you didn't have the same effect. And, you can think about those as, in that particular case, as the lack of safe haven across the border in the conflict in Iraq compared to what was present for the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the nascent realignment among the ethnicity which was supporting the insurgency. So the Sunnis in Iraq, the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. There was no nascent realignment happening among the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. And so that enabling condition wasn't present. And, could share tons of examples, but what that question highlights is when you do the data analysis, it's never just the data. You have some underlying theory about the world and how you get from the policy to the outcome. And so you observe the relationship in one place, and then you need to ask yourself, like, are all the other things that led from that cause to that effect, are they present in the new place that I want to apply this? It's one of those cognitive skills we talked about like 20 minutes ago. And what I think is interesting is many of us do that very naturally when the evidence is a story, right? When the evidence is like an anecdote or a historical case study. But somehow it's much harder when the evidence is data. We think like that will automatically apply. The analogy will be good if it's data. And we shouldn't do that, right? We need to think about the analogizing from data in ways that are more similar to how we think about analogizing from stories. And many of us are great at analogizing from stories, but when data comes in, suddenly we give it like more credence as applying in new places. And that's a cognitive mistake. And I think that's one of those things where we can do a lot better in the PME system.
Okay, great. Well, this next question is kind of a biggie. I think we can all agree that asymmetric conflict is here to stay. And in your book, in your concluding chapter, you discuss lessons for policy, or what you stated as what works to reduce violence. So like I said, kind of a big question, but could you summarize some of these lessons, these principles for our audience, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest, I think, and most important principle is think small. So one of the things we observe again and again in the book is small changes can have big effects. So putting up a cell phone tower enables a radical change in the insurgent dynamics in a given area. Spending a few dollars per capita on aid leads to big differences in how a population works with military forces. And doing large things is often counterproductive because it disrupts local political equilibrium, it brings in corruption, it shifts the labor market, it just kind of like messes things up dramatically in lots of ways that are very hard to anticipate. And so what we see, if you think about what is easier to execute and what is more likely to get you the political change that you want, it's doing those small things. And so when we think about interventions, we need to kind of break this view that more dollars equals more progress towards the policy goal, and think instead about finding that kind of right amount given an understanding of the situation, which will advance the policy goal. So I think that's, to me, I think that's the most important principle. I think that the second most important principle is really to think about basically all the parties to the interaction and how they'll respond to each other before you think about how to interpret the evidence that the world gives you. And so, if, for example, you see an action is taken and then violence goes up, that could mean you're succeeding or it could mean you're failing. It depends on what you believe to be the underlying dynamic that's driving the interaction. So you need to bring that theory, that understanding of what's creating the data to analyzing it. So I think those are the two most important ones, but really, thinking small in terms of interventions in asymmetric conflicts is really, I think, the key lesson from the book. I think the last maybe strategic lesson is, if you believe the body of research we talk about in the book, there does exist an algorithm to win a given village or a given valley in ways that are, acceptable to, our norms and ethics and standards of how you should treat people. That does not mean that it makes sense to get involved necessarily in asymmetric conflicts. There has to be some theory of how do you go from winning the village and the valley to the political settlement for it to make sense, because if you don't have that theory, you end up with a situation like Afghanistan, where villages and valleys are won repeatedly, many times over many years, and there's not progress towards that political settlement. And so the kind of ability to do something at the local level doesn't necessarily mean something should be done. There has to be that second process of thinking about, okay, if we create order in all these areas, is that going to create political space or a pathway to a settlement of the deep issue that's driving the conflict? And if the answer to that is no, despite the fact that you kind of know how to do the local thing, it may not make sense to do so.
I think that's very good advice. Well, sir, we've exhausted my questions, and I don't see any other questions from the audience, but before we sign off, I'd like to give you one last opportunity for any closing comments to our US SOCOM audience members today.
I think the biggest thing is, is really thinking about the wisdom that resides in the force. So, my colleagues and I have joked around that we spent a decade proving what any good SF sergeant would have told us at the start, and many did tell us at the start. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, when you think about that as a broader principle, right, for thinking about asymmetric conflicts, the U.S. military now, there's probably never been a force in the history of the world that has had as much experience in as diverse a set of asymmetric conflicts as this military has. And if you believe that this is going to be a prominent way of fighting in the future, because the era of great power competition is going to mean lots of small wars in lots of places around the world. There's a massive repository of knowledge there that can and should be mined. And something we really haven't invested in, at least that I'm aware of, is pulling that knowledge together in a more systematic and consistent way before it has completely left the force as people finish their careers, retire, and move on to other things.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Professor. Your book, Small Wars, Big Data, has been called essential reading for advanced students of counterinsurgency strategy. The book provides groundbreaking perspectives for how small wars can be better strategized and favorably won to the benefit of the population. It also provides, in my opinion, excellent practical lessons from the past 2 decades of conflict while examining the complex relationships between the insurgents, the government, and the civilians. So, sir, on behalf of our president, Dr. Ike Wilson, who asked me to thank you personally, I also want to thank you for very much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Cal, you are very welcome. Thank you to everyone for listening. I hope it was helpful to folks. You know, we do this work because we want to help people like you who are out there in the fight, and I hope it's useful.
Great. Well, for our audience members today, if you have any feedback on this session, or if you have any feedback on any of our Think JSOU activities, please contact us at thinkjsou@socom.mil. And also, if you want to nominate guest speakers for the future, please contact us at that same email address. I'd like to close by once again encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing to the library or on one of the social media channels on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and APAN. Additionally, the US SOCOM Library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books or to download past and present JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. And of course, you can always check out what upcoming courses or events we have at JSOU by going to the website www.socom.mil/JSOU. And this series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies at the Joint Special Operations University. And finally, I want to thank everyone for attending and watching this afternoon.